Until the Renaissance era of exploration, the center of the world was the Mediterranean. Then, with Christopher Columbus's late 15th century voyage to a new world, far across the vast Atlantic Ocean, an intense list of journeys forged a lasting connection between the Mediterranean and American worlds. By 1607, eager adventurers from England had landed their vessels near the mouth of the James River and built Jamestown, Britain's first permanent settlement in America. Though hardships beset these first colonists, new settlers and supplies continued to arrive, and the development of the New World quickly spread inland from the Atlantic coastline. By the time that the Revolutionary War began in 1775, American pioneers were already pushing beyond the Appalachians. In 1783, the war ended and the British signed the Treaty of Paris, which granted the United States sovereignty over the massive Trans-Appalachian wilderness bordered on the west by the Mississippi River. During this era of expansion, the archetypical frontiersman was the legendary Daniel Boone. Boone was Kentucky's first true settler. In 1775, he forged the Wilderness Road and transformed the pathway into a well-marked route running westward from Virginia through the Cumberland Gap and into Kentucky and Tennessee. The Wilderness Road, sometimes called the Wilderness Trail, hastened the movement of settlers seeking to establish homes in the newly available lands. Other adventurers would follow Boone's example. They were stereotyped as a breed of restless, uneducated men who loved the outdoors and hunting, who sought adventure and enjoyed learning the ways of the Native American Indians. Tall tales have been passed on about these men who dressed in buckskin and carried long rifles. But because of their restless daring, the routes down the Ohio River and up the Kentucky River hastened the important links to the western lands of the United States. By 1803, the youthful nation was also a quickly growing nation. That year, the United States bought most of the land between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains from France in the Louisiana Purchase. Through the transaction, the United States acquired 530 million acres of land for only $15 million, a bargain price in any year. As President Thomas Jefferson signed the Louisiana Purchase Treaty, he knew that he was doubling the size of the country. He was also aware that no one knew what this new wilderness looked like. Jefferson believed that these uncharted lands held America's destiny. He soon enlisted the services of Meriwether Lewis to trace a route from the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean. The hope was that Lewis and his partner William Clark would discover a direct path west that would also stimulate the young country's trade economy with the Eastern world. As they set out on their discovery, William Clark wrote, "I set out at 4:00 p.m. in the presence of many of the neighboring inhabitants and proceeded on under a gentle breeze up the Missouri." Over the next 2.5 years, the Lewis and Clark expedition covered 8,000 miles. They traveled from St. Louis up the Missouri River through the Rocky Mountains, a massive obstacle that no one had anticipated. They crossed the mountains and canoed down the Columbia River to the Pacific Ocean. The journey of Lewis and Clark helped write the final pages of the saga begun by Christopher Columbus nearly 300 years earlier. Their abundant notes and drawings of the geography of the region and the wildlife and inhabitants that they encountered paved the way for the conquest of the West and furthered the independence of America from the rest of the world community. Lewis and Clark provided a detailed image of the continent-spanning landscape, but the boundaries of the United States were far from complete. Two rivals existed, a newly independent Mexico and the Indian nations. In 1821, Mexico revolted against Spain, hoping to secure her independence as well as her control of the province of Texas. At the same time, Spain, hoping to encourage development of sparsely settled Texas, took the unusual step of granting Texas land to speculator Moses Austin for the settlement of 300 American families. When Moses died, his son, Stephen Austin, spearheaded the movement and negotiated with the reluctant Mexican government to permit the colonization. Mexico even exempted the Anglo-Americans from taxation and maintained the Texas province on a fairly loose rein. Then, in 1834, the pompous General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, nicknamed the Napoleon of the West, became dictator and tightened his control of the Texans. In time, the Texans were in full-blown rebellion against Santa Anna. Sam Houston, the former governor of Tennessee, was named the commander of the Texas force. The war lasted a little over a year and was marked by savagery and heroism. In February 1836, the Alamo, a fortified mission near San Antonio, would become the site of one of the most famous battles and a classic symbol of Western heroism. As Santa Anna and thousands of Mexican soldiers lay siege to the Alamo, about 180 Texans prepared to defend themselves. Inside were famous frontiersmen such as Davy Crockett, Jim Bowie, Colonel William B. Travis, and a legion of Texans who refused to comply with Santa Anna's demand for immediate surrender. Every one of the defenders died, but their resistance rallied others who defeated the Mexicans 6 weeks later, crying, "Remember the Alamo." Soon the Mexicans found themselves in retreat and obliged to recognize Texas independence. By the 1840s, the concept of manifest destiny was used to describe the continued expansion of America across the Mississippi into the Great Plains. In July 1845, New York Morning News editor John O'Sullivan wrote, "The American claim is by the right of our manifest destiny to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent which Providence has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty." It was as if God himself had ordained the Western expansion as a mission of the Anglo-American. This expansion involved not merely territorial increases, but the progress of liberty and individual economic opportunity as well. The same year, James Knox Polk became the 11th President of the United States. Polk was committed to expansionism and promised to seize Mexican territory in the Southwest and the Oregon Territory in the Northwest. Polk was an efficient and determined executive. With the annexation of Texas in 1845, he provoked the Mexicans and further stirred their ire by sending a representative to purchase California and New Mexico. When that mission failed, Polk prepared for war. In March 1846, General Zachary Taylor occupied Point Isabel on the Rio Grande, which the Mexicans viewed as an act of aggression. When they shelled the American soldiers, Polk pronounced the Mexican actions as an invasion of American soil. On May 13, 1846, the U.S. declared war against Mexico. In September 1847, American troops entered Mexico City and remained until peace was restored. In 1848, the two countries signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo to end the war. Mexico ceded 2/5 of its territory to the U.S. and received a payment of $15 million. After the war, author Herman Melville wrote, "We Americans are the peculiar chosen people, the Israel of our time. We bear the ark of the liberties of the world. God has predestined. The rest of the nations must be in our rear." The acquisition of 500,000 square miles from Mexico included the land of future states California, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico. Meanwhile, President Polk peacefully settled the Oregon boundary dispute with England. Now, through war and diplomacy, the United States held title to lands that stretched from one coast to the other. Settlers eagerly embraced the opportunities. During this period of Western expansion, over 350,000 Americans traveled by covered wagon across the Overland Trail to Oregon or to California. On January 24, 1848, only 9 days before California was added to the American Republic, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill near Sacramento. Word soon spread, and thousands of fortune seekers descended upon the area. By the following year, 1849, about 80,000 49ers had stampeded to the California gold fields. Wrote one victim of gold fever, "A frenzy seized my soul. Piles of gold rose up before me, castles of marble. The Rothschilds, Gerards, and Astors appeared to be but poor people. In short, I had a very violent attack of gold fever." By 1853, nearly 250,000 had become members of the gold rush mania. Few became rich, but most remained and found jobs or started farms or other businesses. Lawless and violent mining camps gave way to permanent settlements with organized government and law enforcement. Meanwhile, vast new territories opening up in the West were a growing source of conflict between the states of the North and South. Each section wanted to control the Western territories. The South needed new lands for the large-scale cultivation of cotton and other crops with slave labor. The North, on the other hand, demanded the Western lands be reserved for the free labor of independent farmers and workers. As each territory reached statehood and gained congressional voting, the crucial question was, would that state enter the Union as a free state or a slave state? The slavery issue threatened the very fiber of the nation. In addition, conflict over the route of the proposed transcontinental railroad had delayed territorial organization of the region. The worsening relations between the North and South states came to a head on January 4, 1854, when Senator Stephen Douglas, wanting to ensure a northern railroad route that would benefit his Illinois constituents, introduced a bill to organize the territory of Nebraska in order to bring the area under civil control. But Southern senators objected. The region lay north of latitude 36 degrees, and so, under the terms of the Missouri Compromise of 1820, it would be a free state. To gain the Southerners' support, Douglas presented a bill that made concessions by creating the two separate territories of Kansas and Nebraska, and overturned the long-standing Missouri Compromise, which had held slavery in check. Soon, the territory of Kansas became a battleground for rival factions as anti-slavery guerrilla bands and pro-slavery border ruffians struggled in bloody campaigns to control the territorial government. By the time Kansas became the 34th state in 1861, Southern states had begun to secede from the Union. The Civil War between the North and the South began on April 12, 1861, and would last 4 long years. When the South surrendered in 1865, westward expansion continued at a furious pace. The railroad was eventually built, but not along the route Stephen Douglas wanted. The railroad provided quick and dependable transportation between the east and west coast, the ultimate link in the vastness of the nation. Railroad travel, barring storms, floods, breakdowns, Indian attacks, or holdups, trimmed travel time from months to days. Construction of the railroad from the east was done by the Union Pacific, which rushed to lay its tracks westward out of Omaha. From the west, the Central Pacific sent crews with their irons and spikes toward the east. It was a bitter race between the two companies. Finally, on May 10, 1869, the two railroads met at Promontory Point, Utah, and a golden spike was driven into a tie, signaling the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, linking the nation's commerce, industry, and agriculture. But the success of Western expansion in the 1860s was not simply a contest of two businesses. The intrusion of the railroad was not without its casualties. During the next decade, as trains began their trek across the country, the balance of animal and human life was to be drastically altered. Trains sped up the assault of professional hide hunters who killed 15 million buffalo. Before long, the great beasts came perilously close to extinction. The near demise of the buffalo was only overshadowed by the near extinction of the Indian civilization. From the moment that the first explorers set foot on the shores of North America, the Indian culture was challenged to coexist with the Anglo intruders. Now, with the perpetual expansion westward, the Indians were driven into unwanted territories and stood in fear of complete destruction. Since the white man has made a road across our land and killed off our game, we are hungry, explained Shoshone Indian Chief Washakie. Our women and children cry for food, and we have no food to give them. But the sentiments of manifest destiny prevailed. Advocates of Native Americans were clearly ineffective in the face of strong-willed proponents such as General William Tecumseh Sherman, who said, "The more we kill this year, the less will have to be killed in the next. They all have to be killed or maintained as a species of paupers." Though the Indians faced certain doom, it would not be without a fight. Their fierce desperation became a decade-long struggle to retain their heritage and maintain their dignity, and history would remember the names of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. And the 1876 Battle of Little Bighorn would become a pivotal moment for the Indian struggle. In June 1876, General George Armstrong Custer led the 7th Cavalry in a campaign against the Sioux Indians near the Little Bighorn River in Montana. His entire detachment of over 200 men was annihilated in a battle referred to as Custer's Last Stand. It also proved to be the Indians' last major triumph. Enraged Americans became determined to contain the Indians. The Indian people were forced to live on permanent reservations. Military actions against the Indians in the second half of the 19th century helped convince adventurous settlers to overlook the seeming harsh conditions of the Great Plains, the immense spans of land bordered by the Rocky Mountains on the west, sloping into the lowlands of the Midwest states. In the early 1800s, reports filtered back that the entire plains area was bleak and harsh. It was dubbed the Great American Desert and was avoided by early settlers. But not all groups were discouraged. Among those who saw the vast emptiness as a potential sanctuary were the Mormons, members of a religious sect founded by Joseph Smith in 1830. Their communal lifestyle and growing prosperity had aroused the jealousy and suspicion of their neighbors. They were hounded from Ohio to Missouri to Illinois. After Smith's murder in 1844, Brigham Young led them across Iowa into Nebraska, where they established winter quarters near present-day Omaha. Seeking a place where they might live in peace, they continued their westward movement in 1847 and arrived at the valley of the Great Salt Lake in Utah. These first pioneers to the area endured great hardship, but by the early 1860s, Salt Lake City had a population of 12,000. And though the Mormons would struggle against their territory from becoming a state, the differences between them and the federal government were resolved, and Utah entered the Union in 1896. While the Mormons were seeking to establish their religious community in the West, a group of adventurous emancipated slaves were also seeking a better life in the West. The greatest movement westward occurred from 1877 to 1881, when between 40,000 and 70,000 African Americans left former slave states for a new life in places like Kansas, Iowa, Nebraska, and Oklahoma. Despite the harsh climate, white hostility, and difficulty obtaining bank loans, thousands persevered. Blacks penetrated the West as homesteaders and as gunslingers, Indian fighters, peace officers, and prospectors. At the same time, a romanticized class of cattlemen called cowboys was herding longhorns through Texas. They went by nicknames: Pinnacle Jack, Mesquite Bill, Bronco Jim, Buckskin Joe, and Wyoming Pete. They were young, an average age of 24 years. Most were Texans, and often were ex-Confederate soldiers dissatisfied with the outcome of the Civil War. But there were also Mexicans and blacks among them. Most were poor and willing to work long and arduous hours for little pay at the end of the trail drive. Said cowboy Charles Goodnight, "All in all, my years on the trail were the happiest I ever lived. There were many hardships and dangers, of course, that called on all a man had of endurance and bravery, but when all went well, there was no other life so pleasant." Settlers became bitter as cattle drives infringed upon their lands and waters. Said one Kansas farmer in 1885, The cowmen look upon us the same as the Indians do the white man, driving them off their hunting grounds. In 1889, white settlers were being beckoned to the arid, windswept plains of Oklahoma. Until that time, Oklahoma had been a dumping ground for displaced Indians. But as the railroad expansion through the area continued, the government yielded to pressure to open the land to settlers. By April 22, 1889, thousands of pioneers on foot, riding horses, and in wagons had lined up on the border of the Oklahoma lands. At noon, the sound of a signal gun rang out, sending these settlers racing into the Indian territories to stake out their homestead claims. Other land rushes would soon follow. In December 1890, the U.S. 7th Cavalry massacred more than 200 Sioux men, women, and children at Wounded Knee Creek, South Dakota. The Indian culture was finally subdued and relegated to reservations. While Native Americans fell victim to the westward expansion, they eventually began to blend the white man's ways into their own. As the United States headed into the 1890s, its boundaries now stretched from one ocean to the other. Nearly 400 years had passed since the arrival of Columbus in the New World. But in a span of less than 50 years, the United States had marched westward to the Pacific Ocean and altered everything in its path. In 1893, historian Frederick Jackson Turner summarily wrote, "At the end of 100 years of life under the Constitution, the frontier is gone, and with its going has closed the first period of American history." Indeed, only a handful of statehoods remained. Idaho and Wyoming had become the 43rd and 44th states in 1890, Utah the 45th in 1896. After the turn of the century, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Arizona completed the 48-state union that would remain intact until 1959. Meanwhile, the western United States evolved into a changing home for various groups: settlers and farmers, the cowboys and the cavalry, the Indians and the freed slaves. There were notorious outlaws such as Billy the Kid and Jesse James, and infamous lawmen such as Bat Masterson, Wild Bill Hickok, and Doc Holliday. The restless energy of the American people would result in great historical strides in every aspect of life. But a love affair with the saga of how the West was won started long before there was a Hollywood. It began with a larger-than-life man called Buffalo Bill Cody, whose mission was to entertain people with the folklore of the Wild, Wild West. William Frederick Cody was born in Iowa in 1846 and moved with his family to Kansas in 1854. By age 20, he rode for the Pony Express, served as an Army scout, and fought Indians. He gained great fame in the West for killing a reported 4,280 buffalo to feed the construction crews of the Kansas Pacific Railroad. As a scout for the 5th United States Cavalry from 1868 to 1872, he participated in several Indian fights. But it was his shrewd ability to capitalize on the hunger for entertainment in out-of-the-way places of the West that spawned his traveling show in 1883. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show featured bands of Indians, cowboys, rough riders, bucking broncos, and buffaloes. The famed sharpshooter Annie Oakley also toured with Buffalo Bill. Through his action-packed extravaganza, the romantic legends of the frontier were kept alive. Even former foe Sitting Bull participated for a few months. Buffalo Bill was made the hero in many fictional tales, and the distinction between the man and the myth became indivisible. But he is clearly one of the authentic Western heroes. While a youthful Buffalo Bill was out fighting Indians, the U.S. was still expanding its territory after the Civil War. In 1868, Secretary of State William Seward opened negotiations that led to the purchase of Alaska from Russia. Though the vast region was bought for a mere $7.2 million, many scoffed at the purchase and dubbed it Seward's Folly. With the purchase of Alaska, the United States acquired an area twice as large as Texas, But it was not until the Great Klondike Gold Strike of 1896 that Alaska was accepted as a valuable addition to American territory. In January 1959, Alaska became the 49th state. With the annexation of Hawaii in 1898, present-day borders were defined. In 1900, Hawaii was made a territory. In 1959, it was admitted as the 50th state in the Union. In less than 2 centuries since its independence from British rule, the 13 original states had grown to 50. The Westward movement is the story of America and its ambitious early residents, a people emboldened by the frontier spirit, a sense of adventure and daring. Their tales can be realistically sobering, as well as delightful myths of survival. The 19th century writer Henry David Thoreau perfectly summed up the saga of the American West when he wrote, "Eastward I go by force, but westward I go free."